A company bet more money than it was worth the entire company on building an impossible plane inside an impossible factory. They moved more earth than the Panama Canal, raised the largest building in the world, and inside it, they changed forever how humanity moves across the planet. That same company killed 346 people because they chose a cheap software patch instead of designing a new airplane. The whistleblower who exposed them was found dead from a gunshot in a hotel parking lot while he was testifying against them. And 5 years after the deaths, one of their planes had a door blow off mid-flight because 4 bolts were never installed at the factory. 4 bolts. This is Boeing. And their story is far darker than you think. There's a building in Washington state where it rains indoors. That's not a metaphor. It's the largest building in the world by volume, so absurdly massive that warm air rises, moisture condenses near its ceiling 115 feet up, and actual clouds form inside it. Boeing had to install a massive ventilation system just to stop it from raining on their own airplanes. 1 million light bulbs illuminate the interior. 26 cranes hang from rails on its ceiling. All of Disneyland fits inside with 12 acres to spare. It has its own fire department, its own medical clinic, its own bank, 19 cafeterias serving 17,000 meals a day, and 1,300 shared bicycles because walking from one end to the other would take too long. A city inside a building. And within those walls, they built the most iconic airplane in aviation history, the Boeing 747, the Queen of the Skies, which carried nearly 6 billion passengers around the planet. But the last 747 rolled out of there on January 31st, 2023. Now what's being assembled inside the largest factory on Earth is the 737 MAX. The airplane that killed 346 people? How did Boeing go from building the impossible to not being able to put 4 bolts in a door? The answer starts with a man who waited 3 days for a flight that never came. William Edward Boeing was born on October 1st, 1881, in Detroit, Michigan, in a mansion with the most refined collection of German literature in the city. His father, Wilhelm Boeing, was a German immigrant who arrived in the United States in 1868. Without a penny, his own family had disowned him for emigrating, and in 3 decades built a colossal fortune in the timber industry and iron mining in Minnesota. His mother, Marie Ortmann, was the daughter of a prominent Viennese businessman. Think about that starting point. A boy raised among Goethe's books and timber money, surrounded by the raw wealth of industrial America. But tragedy didn't knock before walking in. In 1890, when William was just 8 years old, his father fell ill with influenza during a business trip to New York and died on the train back to Detroit, 42 years old. Gone in a rail car, while the tracks rolled beneath him, his mother remarried a doctor from Virginia, and young William, who apparently didn't get along with his stepfather at all, was shipped off to an elite boarding school in Vevey, Switzerland. The same school financier J.P. Morgan had attended 30 years earlier. Then he went through St. Paul's School in New Hampshire and enrolled at Yale's Sheffield Scientific School to study engineering. Did he graduate? No. He dropped out after 2 years. When his mother died in 1910, he inherited a fortune of nearly $1 million. In today's money, about $24 million. That money would fund an obsession. Boeing moved to the Pacific Northwest in 1903. The same year, the Wright brothers flew for the first time at Kitty Hawk to manage his father's timber lands. He was a reserved man, a perfectionist, deeply solitary. His main hobby was hunting. He traveled every year to Alaska and British Columbia to hunt and fish. He stayed single until he was 40. An orphaned millionaire who lived among forests and rivers and was in no rush to share his life with anyone, until he looked up at the sky. In 1909, at the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle, he saw a flying machine for the first time. He was mesmerized. The following year, at the Dominguez Air Meet in Los Angeles, he desperately tried to get a ride. He asked every single pilot. They all turned him down. The French aviator Louis Paul Hahn was the only one who said yes. And Boeing waited. 3 days. 3 full days going to the airfield, staring at the sky, waiting for a promise that evaporated like the fuel in those primitive engines. Paul Hahn had left for Salt Lake City without telling him. Historians call it the biggest missed opportunity of Paul Hahn's life. He never gave a ride to the man who would build the largest airplane company in the world, but that frustration lit a fire that never went out. In August of 1915, Boeing enrolled in Glenn Martin's flight school in Los Angeles and bought a seaplane. When his pilot damaged the aircraft in a crash on Lake Washington and Martin told him replacement parts would take months, Boeing turned to his friend, naval engineer Conrad Westervelt, and said the words that changed history. "We could build a better airplane ourselves, and faster." On June 15, 1916, Boeing personally piloted his first airplane from Lake Union in Seattle. A month later, he founded the Pacific Aero Products Company with fewer than a dozen employees in a red boathouse on the Duwamish River, the legendary Red Barn that's preserved today at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. Among his first employees was Wang Su, a Chinese immigrant and one of the first graduates of MIT's aeronautical engineering program, a lonely millionaire, a brilliant Chinese engineer, and a boathouse by a river. That's where Boeing came from. By 1929, he'd built a vertical empire. He merged his company with Pratt & Whitney to form the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, which controlled airplane factories, engines, propellers, and United Airlines. How big are we talking? An original investment of $259 turned into $12 million in 6 years. But Senator Hugo Black launched a congressional investigation into airmail contracts, and Boeing was grilled for 6 hours. The Airmail Act of 1934 forced the breakup of his empire. Boeing, furious because he believed the whole thing had been political theater, resigned as chairman, sold most of his stock, and swore he'd never deal with the federal government again. Later investigations confirmed that neither he nor his executives had done anything illegal. He walked away clean, but he walked away, and he never came back. But here's the part that doesn't make it into the feel-good version of the story. The part Boeing would rather you forget. Between 1935 and 1944, William Boeing and his wife Bertha developed extensive residential properties north of Seattle and slapped racial covenants on every single one. The language was explicit. No property shall at any time be sold, leased, or rented to any person not of the white or Caucasian race. The only exception was if non-white people were employed as domestic servants. Boeing was one of the largest real estate developers to use these covenants in the entire Seattle area. An aviation visionary who drew lines in the sky and lines on the ground. The ones in the sky connected continents. The ones on the ground segregated human beings. That contradiction is the first dark heartbeat in the soul of Boeing. It wouldn't be the last. Because what came next transformed Boeing from an airplane company into a war machine. And underneath the war machine, there was a truth very few people want to remember. From its founding in 1916 to 1942, Boeing never hired a single black person. 26 years. Not one. Why? Because the machinists' union that represented Boeing's workers had an oath that literally stated, "I will not recommend for membership in this union any person not of the white race." That wasn't language from the Deep South. That was Seattle. When President Roosevelt signed an executive order in April 1941 banning racial discrimination among defense contractors, Boeing ignored it. They were hiring 1,000 people a week and not a single one was black. Boeing's personnel manager responded to the NAACP by pointing the finger at the union. Only those of the Caucasian race are acceptable to them. Convenient. Only when the desperation of war made it impossible to find enough white workers did Boeing open its doors. The first two black employees in Boeing's history were Florrie Spearman and Dorothy West Williams, hired in 1942. Women. Catherine Tompkins came all the way from Tulsa, trained as a welder. "When we got here," she said, "they wouldn't let us do welding because of our race. They were pushed into the lowest skilled positions." At peak wartime, Boeing had 1,600 black workers, out of a workforce of 30,000. Let that sink in. And speaking of those 30,000 workers, Boeing literally bet everything it had on the war. How much? $275,000, the entire company, down to the last penny when they were in the red with just 600 employees, to develop the B-17 Flying Fortress. If the plane failed, Boeing was gone. It didn't fail. At peak production, 12 B-17s a day, 300 a month, and over the factory that built them, the most cinematic camouflage of the entire war. A fake neighborhood designed by Major John Detley, a set designer from MGM Studios in Hollywood. 53 phony houses, 24 garages, a gas station, and 3 greenhouses, with trees made of chicken feathers and chicken wire. Burlap lawns painted green, canvas streets, with signs reading Synthetic Street and Burlap Boulevard. Workers were told to walk among the fake houses during breaks and hang clothes on laundry lines to keep up the illusion. Did it work? So well that friendly American pilots sometimes got lost trying to find the factory underneath. 30,000 people building bombers beneath a Hollywood neighborhood, with fake houses, feather trees, and a racial policy as phony as the streets painted above their heads. And then came August 6, 1945. A Boeing B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. The development of the B-29 cost more than the Manhattan Project itself. The company that helped save the free world also helped usher in the nuclear age. After that came the B-52 Stratofortress. 744 units built, first flight in 1952. The incredible part? It's still in active service over 70 years later. The Air Force plans to keep it flying until 2050 or 2060, nearly a century in the air. An airplane designed when Eisenhower was president that'll still be flying when your grandchildren have kids. That tells you what Boeing was capable of building when the engineers were in charge. Remember that. You're going to need it later when we talk about a plane that couldn't keep a door on. Boeing was never simple. Never just good or just bad. It was both at once, with an intensity that defied logic. And that intensity was about to multiply 1,000-fold. Because 20 years after Hiroshima, 2 men climbed aboard John Wayne's yacht to go salmon fishing. And what they agreed on while casting lines into Puget Sound changed the world all over again. In the summer of 1965, Juan Trippe and Bill Allen rented the actor John Wayne's yacht, the Wild Goose, to go salmon fishing on Puget Sound. Who was Trippe? The CEO of Pan Am. Born in 1899 in New Jersey, Yale graduate, member of the secret society Skull and Bones, naval aviator, and briefly a Wall Street employee before getting bored and founding an airline. Trippe dreamed in one dimension only: big. His policy was to order airplanes that were typically twice the size of the previous generation. His obsession: a plane that would cut per-seat costs by 30% and democratize international travel. Who was Allen? His perfect opposite. A shy lawyer from Montana, Harvard Law graduate, who turned down the presidency of Boeing because he didn't think he was qualified. But behind that conservative exterior were the instincts and nerves of a high-stakes poker player. Allen always traveled with 2 pairs of glasses and a box of Triscuit crackers. He'd bet Boeing's future multiple times, and every time he'd won. But what came next was the biggest gamble in the history of the industry. While casting their lines, Tripp pushed Allen to build an airplane capable of carrying passengers to the farthest corners of the planet. The exchange became legend. "If you build it, I'll buy it," Tripp said. "If you buy it, I'll build it," Allen replied. Just like that, on a borrowed boat, fishing rods in hand, the Puget Sound shimmering under the summer sun, the 747 was born. On April 13, 1966, Pan Am formally ordered 25 Boeing 747s for $525 million, equivalent to about $3.9 billion today. The largest single order in commercial aviation history. And here's the irony that makes it all the more delicious. The 747 was born from a defeat. Boeing had competed for the military C-5, a transport contract against Lockheed. The Air Force considered Boeing's design superior, but Lockheed undercut them on price and won. What did Boeing inherit from that losing design? The raised cockpit and the hinged nose door that created the 747's iconic hump. And Lockheed? They built only 131 C-5 Galaxis and nearly went bankrupt. Boeing lost the contract and created the most iconic airplane in history. Sometimes losing is the best way to win, but they needed a man to make it real. Joe Sutter, the father of the 747, was born in 1921 in Seattle, son of a Slovenian immigrant butcher. As a kid, he'd ride his bike to Boeing Field just to watch the planes. He paid his first semester of college $32.50 with money from his paper route. He worked as a riveter at Boeing's plant to pay for the rest. When Boeing's president demanded he cut 1,000 engineers from his 4,500-strong team, Sutter insisted in a tense meeting that gutting his crew would destroy the program. He walked out convinced he was about to get fired. He kept his job, and all his engineers. He was going to need every one of them, because what Boeing set out to do was unprecedented. They needed somewhere to build an airplane that didn't fit inside any existing factory. They evaluated more than 50 cities. Sutter vetoed California. If he was going to spend 25% of his time traveling, when the hell was he supposed to design the airplane? They bought 780 acres of virgin forest, north of Seattle. No roads, no railroad, nothing. Just trees, a swamp, and bears. How much earth did they move? 4.5 million cubic meters. More than the Panama Canal and the Grand Coulee Dam combined. It rained 67 days straight. And in a moment that sounds like something out of a comedy of errors, 12 railcars loaded with blue steel from Ohio simply vanished in transit. An employee had to fly to a nearby airstrip, take a cab to the train station, and convince the station master to reconnect the cars. But here's the craziest part. On January 3, 1967, the first 113 production workers showed up to start building the first 747. The building had no walls, no complete roof. They were nicknamed the Incredibles. Paul Staley, machinist, remembered. There were times you'd walk into the machine shop and it was filled with fog because the building was open on one side. We were building the factory, the tooling, and the airplane all at the same time. Picture that scene. Men riveting the guts of an airplane that had never existed, inside a building that didn't exist yet either, with Pacific Northwest rain blowing in through gaps in the unfinished walls. Malcolm Stamper, the program chief, grew up poor in Detroit. His father painted cars at Ford. In 4 years running the 747 program, he took a single day off. One Christmas. Just one. Sometimes, after long shifts, he'd ask his wife if she wanted to drive to Everett at night, just to look at the plant. The final numbers on that building defy imagination. 98 acres of floor space, the Vatican, the Pentagon, the Capitol, and the Taj Mahal, all fit inside together. 75 football fields, 19 cafeterias, 1,300 bicycles. its own daycare, gym, bank, and water treatment plant. An entire city, under one roof, where clouds form. Sutter's team was burning through $5 million a day. The entire program cost over $1 billion, the equivalent of $6.9 billion today. More than Boeing itself was worth. Total debt topped $2 billion. Bill Allen later admitted, "It really was a project too big for us. And the plane still couldn't fly. And the engines didn't work." The Pratt & Whitney JT9D engines were a nightmare. They were Pratt & Whitney's first high-bypass turbofan, completely new technology. The problems? Chronic. The casings warped during takeoff, and the turbines scraped against the inner walls, shafts snapping, deafening explosions with flames shooting out of the engines, and worst of all, no two engines performed the same. There were more than 30 finished airplanes sitting at Everett, with 5,000-pound concrete blocks dangling from the pylons where the engines should have been. Stamper joked, "We've got the world's largest fleet of gliders." The showdown came when Pratt & Whitney's president flew out to Seattle. Test pilot Jack Waddell invited him on a test flight and deliberately triggered a fuel pooling condition. A thunderous bang shook the entire 747, and a long flame shot out of the engine. The man saw it with his own eyes. Silence. Then he committed his entire company to fixing it. On September 30th, 1968, the 747 was unveiled to the world. The massive hangar doors slowly opened, and a tractor pulled the airplane out into the sunlight. The crowd was speechless. 26 flight attendants, one from every airline that had ordered the plane, christened it by smashing 26 bottles of champagne. On February 9, 1969, the three Ws Waddell, Weigel, and Wallach took off. 75 minutes in the air, a flap on the right wing came loose. Waddell landed and declared, "The 747 is a pilot's dream. I only needed my index finger and thumb." On January 22, 1970, Pan Am operated the first commercial flight from New York to London. But the original aircraft overheated, and they had to swap it for a backup, departing 4 hours late. Nothing in the history of the 747 went clean the first time. Absolutely nothing. But it always came through. Until it didn't. Because everything collapsed. All at once. The recession of 1969 froze sales. The 747 had swallowed over $1 billion in borrowed money. And in 1970, not a single American airline placed a new order for any type of Boeing aircraft. Not one. From nobody. Anywhere in the country. For 18 months, they sold just 2 747s worldwide. Congress killed the supersonic transport program. The fallout? Boeing went from 100,800 employees to 38,690 in 3 years. 62,000 people out on the street. Nearly 2/3 of the entire workforce. Unemployment in Seattle hit 13.8%, more than double the national average. Home prices cratered, shops and restaurants shut down. The birth rate dropped, the suicide rate climbed. One reporter wrote that Seattle had turned into a vast pawn shop, with families selling everything they didn't need to buy food. An entire city dying because one company bet too big and the world didn't want what they were building. And on April 16, 1971, a billboard went up on a highway near SeaTac Airport, fittingly, right across from a cemetery. It read, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" It was dreamed up by 2 real estate agents, Bob McDonald and Jim Youngren, who came up with the idea over beers at the Red Onion Bar. It cost them $160 a month. The biggest billboard company refused to put it up too negative. A smaller outfit agreed, but pulled it down after 2 weeks because of the backlash. 10 words. 10 words that became the symbol of an entire city. Boeing survived on military contracts, building trolleys, boats, even trying its hand at agriculture. Stamper admitted, "We didn't make money on any of it. But they survived. And the crisis had an effect nobody saw coming. Seattle diversified its economy so it would never depend on a single employer again. That planted the seeds for Microsoft and Amazon to arrive decades later. From Boeing's ashes rose the tech capital of the Pacific Northwest. Boeing survived the Boeing bust, survived the engines that wouldn't work, survived the clouds inside its own factory. But what it wouldn't survive was itself. Because in 1997, Boeing opened the door to the people who would tear it apart from the inside. On August 1, 1997, Boeing completed its acquisition of McDonnell Douglas for $13.3 billion. On paper, Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas. In reality, it was the exact opposite. One journalist described the post-merger culture as killer hunter-gatherers meeting Boy Scouts. The killers were McDonnell Douglas. The Boy Scouts were Boeing. The line that still echoes in Seattle to this day. McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's money. Harry Stonecipher, CEO of McDonnell Douglas, and a pure product of the Jack Welch School of Management at General Electric, the famous Neutron Jack, who made his name by vaporizing thousands of jobs, became president of the merged Boeing. What did he think of the engineers who had built the 747, who had designed a B-52 that would still be flying a full century later? He called them arrogant and amateur, people who didn't know how to run a business. He imposed a passion for affordability, a phrase Boeing's engineers despised like a personal insult. And he made the declaration that defines this entire era. When people say, "I changed the culture of Boeing," that was the intent. So that it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. Just like that. The age of the engineers was over. Before the merger, Boeing was a company where engineers were the high church. Everything was designed first, then costed. After the merger, everything had to be justified by cost first. Performance reviews started saying, "Ideas are measured in dollars." Every CEO who followed was a disciple of Jack Welch. Stonecipher, then McNerney, another GE alumnus with a $52 million package, then Calhoun, also from GE. The virus of shareholder value maximization infected Boeing like a fever nobody wanted to cure. In September 2001, after 85 years in Seattle, Boeing moved its headquarters to Chicago, 1,700 miles away from its engineers and factories. 500 administrative employees, separated from 142,000 workers. The result? A physical divorce between the people who gave orders and the people who built things. Ruthless, but at least honest in its intent. Phil Condit, the CEO, who made it happen, married 4 times, went down in the most grotesque Pentagon scandal in decades. Darlene Druyun, nicknamed the Dragon Lady, was the second most powerful procurement official in the Air Force. While negotiating a 100-tanker contract worth $23.5 billion, she was secretly discussing a future job with Boeing's chief financial officer. She inflated the contract price as a parting gift. She shared Airbus's confidential data, and she steered a $4 billion contract toward Boeing because they'd hired her son-in-law. The consequences? 9 months in prison for her. 4 for the CFO. Condit resigned. Boeing paid $615 million in fines. And now comes the decision that planted the time bomb. When the Airbus A320neo threatened the 737, Boeing had 2 choices: design a completely new airplane for roughly $7 billion, or do a cheap 5-year upgrade with bigger engines and a software patch. Which one did they pick? The cheap one. Always the cheap one. Meanwhile, between 2013 and 2019, Boeing spent $43.4 billion on stock buybacks, 104% of all its profits, $3 returned to shareholders for every $1 invested in building better airplanes. The $7 billion a year blown on buybacks was exactly the cost of designing a brand new airplane from scratch. They chose Wall Street over engineering. And the price? The price would be paid by 346 people who never had a say in that decision. But before the deaths, there were screams. Literal screams, with picket signs and barrel fires at the factory gates. Screams that Boeing ignored for decades. Boeing's machinists have gone on strike 8 times in 88 years. The one in 1948 lasted 140 days, the longest in history, with strikebreakers recruited by the Teamsters. The one in 1989 lasted 48 days, with 57,800 workers walking out. One veteran said, "In 20 years, I've worked 28 years' worth of hours with the overtime." But the most prophetic was the strike of 2000, the largest engineers' strike in U.S. history. More than 17,000 engineers from the SPEEA union walked off the job. They grilled hot dogs over barrel fires in front of the gates. One guy decided to learn trumpet during the strike, but really he just pointed the thing toward corporate headquarters and made the most ungodly noise. The battle cry that became a prophecy. No nerds, no birds. Remember that phrase. When Boeing stopped listening to its engineers, people started dying. In 2013, Boeing committed a betrayal its workers never forgave. They threatened to build the 777X out of state unless workers gave up their pension. The workers voted 2-1 against. Boeing's response? They forced a second vote pushed through by the International Union, which passed by a razor-thin 51%. The workers lost their pension. And Boeing's CEO? He had a personal pension of $265,000 a month. $265,000 a month for the man who stripped the pension from the people building his airplanes. The strike of 2024 was the most significant of the century. 33,000 machinists walked off the job at 12:01 in the morning, blasting music, shooting off fireworks, holding homemade signs. 53 days on the picket line. They rejected the first offer by 94.6%, the second by 64%. They approved the third at 59%, a 38% raise over 4 years, and a $12,000 bonus. But they didn't get the pension back. Boeing flat out refused. Nathan Sykes, quality inspector, summed up what everyone was feeling. It used to mean something to tell people you work at Boeing, and now it's embarrassing. Embarrassing. A Boeing quality inspector using that word to describe his own job. And underneath all of this, literally underneath, was the river. Plant 2 in Seattle, where nearly 7,000 B-17s that helped win the war were built, dumped PCBs, chromium, cyanide, and trichloroethylene into the Duwamish River for decades. A Boeing employee magazine from 1950 described the river as a natural collector for Boeing's fluid wastes. Natural, that's what they called it. In 2001, the Environmental Protection Agency designated it a Superfund site. The cleanup will cost $1 billion. Only the salmon is safe to eat from the Duwamish. The perch, the sole, the crabs, and the mussels are still contaminated. The company that built the bombers, that saved the world, poisoned the river right next to that same factory. But neither the poisoned river, nor the ignored strikes, nor the stolen pensions are the darkest chapter of this story. The darkest part was still coming, and 346 people paid for it with their lives. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 took off from Jakarta, bound for Pangkal Pinang, Indonesia. It was a Boeing 737 MAX, just 2 months old. An angle of attack sensor miscalibrated by 21 degrees fed false data to the MCAS system, which repeatedly forced the airplane's nose down. The pilots fought the machine for 13 minutes. MCAS pushed them down more than 26 times. 26 times the machine said down, and 26 times the pilot said up. The machine won. The plane slammed into the Java Sea. 189 dead. But here's the most chilling part. The day before, the same airplane experienced the exact same failure, the exact same one. It was saved only because a third pilot riding as a passenger in the cockpit knew the emergency procedure. What happened next? The captain didn't report the severity of the problem, and the plane went back into service. The next day, 189 people boarded that airplane. None of them knew. On March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crashed near Bishoftu, Ethiopia. 6 minutes after takeoff. Same failure. And here's what should keep you up at night. The pilots followed Boeing's recommended recovery procedure. They did everything right. And they still died. Because at the speed they were flying, nearly 430 miles an hour, the aerodynamic forces made manual trim physically impossible. 157 more dead, 346 total. Captain Sully Sullenberger called the crashes the result of a fatally flawed design. So what was MCAS? A software patch. The Max's larger engines required a different placement on the wings, which changed the aerodynamics. Instead of redesigning the fuselage, Boeing created a software system to make the Max fly like an older 737, so airlines would only need an hour of training on an iPad instead of a full simulator. That was the sales pitch. Buy the Max. You don't have to retrain your pilots. The fatal flaw, MCAS relied on a single sensor out of the two available. If that sensor failed, the system pushed the nose down with no cross-check. An indicator that warned if the sensors disagreed should have been standard. What did Boeing do? They sold it as an optional add-on. Extra, pay-to-play. Neither Lion Air nor Ethiopian bought it. And in 2016, the FAA approved removing all references to MCAS from the flight manual. The pilots never knew it existed. They were flying with a system that could kill them, and nobody told them it was there. But what comes next is what should make every person who boards an airplane wonder who's actually looking out for their life. In December 2018, after Lion Air, but before Ethiopian, the FAA's own analysis predicted 15 more fatal accidents if MCAS wasn't redesigned. 15. Did they ground the fleet? No. 3 months later, 157 more people died. The internal Boeing emails released during the congressional investigations are devastating. This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. Would you put your family on a Max? I wouldn't. I still haven't been forgiven by God for the covering up I did last year. I don't know how to fix these things. It's systemic. It's culture. Boeing paid $2.5 billion in a settlement. And the CEO, Dennis Muhlenberg? He was fired after being grilled before Congress, while sitting near families holding photos of the 346 dead. He walked away with $62 million. Any executives in prison? None. Zero. But the culture that caused those deaths stayed intact. And the proof arrived on January 5, 2024, when Alaska Airlines Flight 1282, a 737 MAX 9, just 2 months old, took off from Portland, Oregon. 6 minutes later, at nearly 16,000 feet, a door panel blew off the fuselage. A hole almost 5 feet wide ripped open in the side of the airplane. Oxygen masks dropped. The vacuum sucked objects out of the cabin. A teenager had his shirt ripped clean off his body. His mother had to hold on to him. The seat next to the hole was empty by pure luck. The cause? 4 bolts that were never reinstalled after a repair at the factory. There was no documentation. Boeing said they couldn't find the records and that they probably never existed. Workers told investigators they felt pressured to work too fast. The panel had been shifting flight after flight 154 times until it blew off. 5 years after 346 deaths, Boeing couldn't make sure 4 bolts were in place. 4 bolts. That's all that separated 177 people from a catastrophe. And now begins the darkest chapter of all. John Barnett, nicknamed Swampy, spent 32 years at Boeing as a quality control manager. In 2010, he was transferred to the Charleston, South Carolina plant. What he found there horrified him. 25% of the 787's emergency oxygen systems would fail during a decompression event. Metal shavings near flight control wiring. Tools left inside finished airplanes. A ladder found inside a horizontal stabilizer. A ladder. Inside, the structure of an aircraft that was about to fly with passengers on board. Management's philosophy, according to Barnett: push the planes out the door and ring the cash register. Barnett was demoted, reassigned, filed a complaint, and retired in 2017, saying, "I haven't seen a single airplane leave Charleston that I'd put my name on and say it's safe." On March 7th and 8th, 2024, Barnett was deposed by Boeing's lawyers in Charleston. The session was paused to resume on March 9th at 10 a.m. At 9, his attorneys called. No answer. Hotel staff performed a welfare check. At 9:42, they heard a gunshot. He was found dead in his orange Dodge Ram pickup in the parking lot of the Holiday Inn. Single gunshot wound to the head. He was 62 years old. His note read, "I can't do this anymore. I pray the sons of bitches who ruined my life will pay. I pray Boeing will pay. Bury me face down so Boeing and its lying leaders can kiss my ass." His lawyers said he was in great spirits, and they saw no indication whatsoever. Then they added, "Boeing may not have pulled the trigger, but the company is responsible for his death." Joshua Dean, 45 years old, a former quality auditor at Spirit Aerosystems, a Boeing supplier, had reported defects in the 737's pressure bulkhead. He was ignored and fired. He was in good health. He died on May 1st, 2024, of pneumonia and a stroke. 53 days after Barnett, 2 whistleblowers dead in less than 2 months. Ed Pearson, a former naval officer and senior manager at the 737 factory, had written in June 2018, "Frankly, right now all my internal alarm bells are going off. For the first time in my life, I hesitate to put my family on a Boeing airplane." He recommended shutting down the factory. The response? He was ignored. 3 months later, Lion Air. 5 months later, Ethiopian. Before the Senate in 2024, he testified, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is a criminal cover-up. 346 people died and there has been no justice." Curtis Eubank, a systems engineer, proposed safety improvements for the MAX in 2014 that could have prevented both crashes. Management rejected them because of cost and timeline. His boss told him before he left, "People have to die before Boeing changes anything." They died, and Boeing didn't change enough. And justice? It never came. In January 2021, Boeing paid $2.5 billion in a deferred prosecution agreement. Paul Njoroge, the man who lost his wife, his 3 children aged 6, 4, and 9 months, and his mother-in-law, on Ethiopian, said, "It lets Boeing off the hook." In May 2025, the Department of Justice reached another deal, an additional $1.1 billion in exchange for not criminally prosecuting the company. In November 2025, Federal Judge Reed O'Connor dismissed the criminal charges. In his ruling, he wrote that the families are right, that the plea agreement does not ensure the accountability necessary to guarantee the safety of the flying public, but he said he lacked the legal authority to block the government's request. Just last week, on February 5th, 2026, 31 families asked an appeals court to revive the case. Njoroge declared, "Without a trial, there would be no meaningful accountability." Javier de Luis, an MIT engineer who lost his sister, said, "The message being sent to corporations is don't worry about making your products safe. 346 dead. Not a single executive behind bars. The criminal case dismissed. The families are still fighting, and nobody paid." But Boeing's story doesn't end with the deaths, because nothing at Boeing ends clean. We need to talk about what's left, what was lost, the full legacy. Let's go back to the Everett factory. On January 31st, 2023, the last 747 rolled out of those walls. It was a freighter for Atlas Air, christened Empower. At the ceremony were survivors of the Incredibles, those 113 workers who built the first airplane inside a building with no walls back in 1967. Joe Sutter's family was there, the son of the Slovenian butcher. Charles Tripp was there, grandson of Juan Tripp, carrying the Pan Am flag for an airline that had ceased to exist 3 decades earlier. And John Travolta was there, a licensed 747 pilot holding back tears as he watched the last bird roll out. 1,574 airplanes built over 54 years. Nearly 6 billion passengers carried. One of the great engineering marvels of the world, like the pyramids of Egypt or the Panama Canal. The airplane that nearly destroyed Boeing became its greatest triumph. It outlasted Pan Am by 3 decades. It democratized air travel exactly the way Juan Tripp dreamed on that borrowed yacht. The final delivery flight traced a crown and the numbers 747 across the sky. A goodbye written in contrails at 30,000 feet. And right up to the end, the 747 was still center stage. The 2 aircraft that will serve as the next Air Force One are based on the 747. The irony? They were originally built for the Russian airline Transaero, which went bust before taking delivery. The contract has ballooned from $3.9 billion to over $6 billion, with Boeing absorbing $2.5 billion in losses. And delivery originally expected in 2024, now isn't anticipated until 2028. They can't even deliver the president's airplane on time. To complete the humiliation, we need to talk about space. NASA paid Boeing $4.2 billion for the Starliner capsule, $1.6 billion more than SpaceX got for Dragon. SpaceX completed its first crewed mission in 2020. Boeing didn't reach its first crewed test until June of 2024. And when astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams launched on what was supposed to be an 8-day mission, they discovered helium leaks and thruster problems. NASA's decision? Too dangerous to bring them back. Starliner returned empty. Wilmore and Williams were stranded 9 months on the International Space Station until SpaceX rescued them on March 18, 2025. The company that put engines on the Saturn V rocket that carried humans to the moon couldn't bring 2 people back from low Earth orbit. SpaceX has completed 11 crewed missions for NASA. Boeing has completed 0 operational missions. 0. Boeing closed 2024 with a loss of $11.82 billion. Its stock hit a peak of $440 right before Ethiopian Airlines. It dropped to $128 during the 2025 sell-off. But the 4th quarter of 2025 showed signs of life. 600 aircraft delivered for the year, the best number since 2018, and a record order backlog of $682 billion. Boeing acquired Spirit Aerosystems in December 2025, the same supplier that built the fuselage on the plane that lost a door. They bought it to control the quality they couldn't control from the outside. There's logic there. But there's also bitter irony. Kelly Ortberg, The new CEO, since August 2024, is the first engineer to run Boeing in years, a deliberate attempt to reverse the financial culture that poisoned the company. He's testified before the Senate, acknowledging serious failures and a lax safety culture. His motto, "Fix it first, then build." Analysts expect the first genuinely cash flow positive year to come in 2026. The 777X, which was supposed to enter service in 2020, isn't expected now until 2027, 7 years behind schedule. There's a future, but there's $60 billion in debt, and there are 346 headstones, and there are families who've spent 7 years begging for a trial that hasn't come, and there's a poisoned river, and there are 2 whistleblowers who will never speak again. Boeing's ironies would be unbelievable in a work of fiction. The company that democratized air travel is now synonymous with negligence. It was founded by an engineer, but governed by bean counters for 3 decades. The founder walked away from the company out of frustration with the government. Today, Boeing depends on Pentagon contracts while being prosecuted by that very same government. It received $8.7 billion in tax incentives from Washington state, the largest corporate subsidy from a single state in U.S. history to preserve jobs, while executing 16 plans to move work out of state and blowing tens of billions on stock buybacks. It sits on an order backlog of $682 billion, more work than it can finish in years, but hasn't turned a sustained profit in 7 years. And the largest factory in the world, built for the 747, now partially produces the 737 MAX, the airplane that killed 346 people. Malcolm Stamper said in 1990, "Boeing would have to screw up pretty badly to fail." They screwed up pretty badly. Let's go back to the beginning, to the factory where it rains indoors, to the clouds that form under a ceiling 115 feet high, to the corridors so long you need a bike to get across. Now you know what it took to build that building. The earth they moved more than the Panama Canal. The 67 days of rain. The 113 Incredibles who assembled the first airplane inside a shell open to the wind. Now you know what was built inside. The 747, 1,574 of them. Nearly 6 billion passengers. Half a century of production. A B-52 that'll still be flying when it turns 100. An airplane that changed how humanity moves across the planet. Now you know what was lost. An engineering culture replaced by a culture of quarterly earnings. $3 to shareholders for every $1 invested in building better airplanes. The nerds who made the birds silenced until what they said no longer mattered. A software system that could kill pilots hidden from the flight manual and sold as an optional extra. Now you know what was paid. 189 people in the Java Sea. 157 in an Ethiopian field. A 62-year-old man in an orange pickup in a Holiday Inn parking lot with a note that said "Bury me face down." A 45-year-old auditor who died 53 days later. A river poisoned with PCBs and cyanide right next to the same factory where the bombers that won the war were built. And now you know who paid and who didn't. The victims' families have spent 7 years asking for a trial. The criminal case was dismissed. Just last week, 31 families went back to an appeals court asking for justice. Dennis Muhlenberg walked away with $62 million. Stonecipher changed the culture and walked. Condit married 4 times and resigned. The engineers shouted "No nerds, no birds," and nobody listened. The workers of 2024 shot fireworks at midnight and still didn't get their pension back. Curtis Eubank proposed a system that would have saved 346 lives, and it was rejected for cost. Ed Pearson begged them to shut down the factory before Lion Air, and was ignored. John Barnett spent years blowing the whistle and ended up dead in a parking lot. The Duwamish River is still contaminated. Only the salmon is safe to eat. William Edward Boeing died on September 28, 1956, of a heart attack aboard his yacht Taconite in Puget Sound. He was 74 years old, 3 days short of 75. His ashes were scattered off the coast of British Columbia. There is no grave. He never saw the 747, never saw the jet age. He only got to see the seed. It all started because he waited 3 days for a flight that never came and decided he could build something better himself. In a red boathouse beside a river his company would poison decades later. With a brilliant Chinese engineer that segregated America, never valued the way he deserved, he founded a company that defined a century. That built bombers beneath a fake Hollywood neighborhood. That bet everything on an impossible airplane inside an impossible factory. That carried nearly 6 billion human beings. And then handed its soul to the money men, silenced its engineers, hid a deadly system, killed 346 people, let whistleblowers die, poisoned a river, stranded 2 astronauts in space, and couldn't put 4 bolts in a door. The largest factory in the world is still there, in Everett, Washington, 115 feet tall, 98 acres, 1 million light bulbs. A place so enormous that clouds form inside it. They're still building airplanes in there. Kelly Ortberg, an engineer, is trying to heal a company that's sick to its core. There are reasons to believe Boeing will survive. It probably will. It's too big, too important to the government, too deeply woven into national defense for them to let it go under. But surviving isn't the same as redemption. The question hanging in the air like those clouds inside the factory isn't whether Boeing will survive. The question is whether the company that carries the name of a lonely millionaire who built something better with his own hands still believes it can, or whether it's settled for building something cheaper. And while someone figures that out, 31 families are waiting for justice in an appeals court, and a poisoned river still flows past the ruins of the factory where the bombers that saved the world were built. And somewhere up in the sky, a 737 MAX with 4 bolts properly in place is carrying 200 people who trust that this time, yes, this time everything will be fine. That trust is what Boeing spent a century building, and what it destroyed in a decade. Because in the end, Boeing's entire story fits in a single image. A building so enormous, it creates its own weather. So ambitious it generates clouds beneath its roof. So badly managed, they had to install giant fans to stop it from raining on their own production line. Boeing has always been that, a company so massive it creates its own storms. The difference is that for half a century, the engineers knew how to keep the clouds at bay. And when they were replaced by accountants, it started to rain. And when it started raining, it wasn't water that fell. It was airplanes falling from the sky. And it was people. William Boeing waited 3 days for a flight that never came. 346 people waited for a landing that never came. The difference is that Boeing got to build his own airplane. They couldn't build their own salvation. Because someone decided safety cost too much. That the engineers were arrogant. That the whistleblowers were a nuisance. That the bolts could wait. The clouds keep forming inside the largest factory in the world. The question is whether someone will look up before it rains again.